So we must do two things, two great things together, to encompass that enormous new view that lies before us, but to encompass it within the framework of science, to see it within the whole categorical framework of science, and to see that these two are not separate, but that they are wedded. The bigness of the idea, the newness of the idea, the greatness of it is one with the structure of science, the structure of being itself. So, can you feel what happened? That when he did that investigation, when he undertook that study, that began to then crystallize, well, what is mind? What does the textbook say mind is? Well, mind is the creator, and mind forms, and mind acts, and it's the power, and the intelligence, and the wisdom, and the law, and the action, and manifestation, and etc., etc., etc. What is spirit? Spirit is, well, let me see, spirit is that purity and that which separates, and it's the only, and it's that which is sorting things out and drawing the dividing line. And so they began to form their lists, much the way we all, or many of us, have done in the past, in the earlier days, form our list from that synonym study. I don't know of many of us who have done all 3,342 references, but we have done a sampling. And in so doing, those 7 synonymous terms begin to crystallize, and as they crystallized, he could see standing out like a mountain peak those ideas which had appeared to him in the various orders that he had found. So, insofar, for instance, as the days of creation are concerned, he could see that those days patterned the order of the answer to the question, what is God, on page 465. And that they coincided, really, that the everything that he could see in those days of creation, feel out in those days of creation as attitudes, as qualities, as states and stages of evolving consciousness. He could see that really patterned in the word order. And so he really, at that point, discovered the pattern. He discovered the pattern that Mrs. Eddy had put into the textbook. That perhaps doesn't sound like much, but to discover the pattern that has patterned the universe, the pattern that has patterned time, scaled all time, scaled every event in time, scaled every evolution, no matter what that evolution would be, whether you call that material or spiritual or whatever. Think of it. He discovered that pattern, which Mrs. Eddy herself had discovered and had gone through the throes of birth to find in her own way of discovery, that she too had that beautiful interplay between the divinely deductive revelation of divine science and the inductive steps over 40 years' time to induce and to conclude, to draw the conclusions that had been really given to her at the very beginning in her initial revelation. So her story is one of writing the textbook and rewriting the textbook and rewriting it again and revising it, and of trying to answer that question, what is God? Trying to define God, of constantly revising that every time she revised her text, she would revise the answer to the question, what is God? Until in at the final point, she could state once and for all the answer to the question, what is God, and get it right, get it absolutely right. And that rightness is borne out by everything else in the textbook. All the chapters, all the layouts of the chapters bear out the final definition, because they are scalings of that pattern. So the whole textbook is filled with the scaling of the seven, the scaling of the word, and then right in that 14th chapter of recapitulation, the pattern itself appears. So you can see that the most important thing is the pattern, and John Dorley rediscovered that pattern. So everything that we've been saying now about the days of creation order, following the order of the definition of God, also is true for the scale of the creativity order, for the order of the third degree. He saw that third degree then was the ordered unfoldment of understanding, and that it was patterned by the, he didn't call it the word order yet. That's why I'm not calling it the word order. But the definition of God. And he only recognized all of this correlation, all of these agreements between these orders after he had completed that synonym study. So each one of these scales then correlates with each other scale also, as well as with the pattern of what soon became known as the word order. So the definition of God became then known as the word order, the fundamental creative order. Also the commandments, the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, all of the further scalings, Dorley explained all of this to his association in 1941. We might say he gave a class on pattern across scale in 1941, giving all the variations of the one fundamental order. As far as the four Bible teachings are concerned, I wanted to put something up. Sorry. Okay. Yes, the four fundamental Bible teachings you find on page 40 of the study aid. And so what began to become clear is that those four all follow the pattern of the word order, as we've said, and they all vary that pattern, as we've said, but something new is coming in, namely that all are related by virtue of the fact that the variations or scales reflect now the further category of the four. You see that? Something is coming in, the four. They reflect the four sides of the holy city. This was actually the first touch of the four coming in. Very, very important. The four comes into the pattern. The operative sense comes into the pattern. So the pattern begins to reveal a new realization, namely that Word, Christ, Christianity, and science are forming another pattern. Okay, so can you see that? The four is coming in, and we're going to find the four are very, very sneaky. It's like the pattern is already enlarging because there's already a touch now in the word order of the Word, of the Christ, of Christianity, and of science. Now, this was not fully, they weren't fully conscious of this at the time. We'll bring that back in later. But you can see, too, that the moment you get the two categories coming together, even in this way as they are, where the seven are reflecting a tone of the four, but they remain the seven. I mean, the Word is reflecting a tone of the four, but it remains the Word. You still have the touch of the two categories coming in together. And when you have two categories together, you get the first touch of structure coming in. Two categories working together. And so actually that's why the four Bible teachings can be seen, can be laid out actually in a matrix form. Can be seen in a matrix form. Well, proceeding with John Dorley's own development then, he began to ask another question, a question he hadn't asked before, one which we've asked, but we can benefit by seeing the place value of that question. He said, is the word order a law only for teaching, for instance, for all of these different scales that we've looked at, or orders as he would call them? He said, is the word order a law that only lends itself to teaching all these truths, or is it a law that is inherent in being and therefore can be seen otherwise? Is it a law in being? Can we find it in being? How can this be verified? And he knew that only in those cases and examples where that law could be seen, if at all, if it could be seen impacting mankind, that this would be an absolutely impersonal proof of the universality of such a law. While he had been doing the synonym study, he had come upon that statement from, isn't it 1 Peter, where Peter says, 1 day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. And this struck him. And he began to feel that there could be a correlation, the same pattern that would be patterning human history itself. So he began to look into that whole question of the history of the 1,000-year periods, and found them to be a further proof of the same law of the word order. About that time, his critics were coming to the fore, having heard about the synonym study, having heard about all of this activity. The Boston was hot on his heels, and the story continues in a moment. From 1914 to 1938, 39, and it was true, and John Dorley knew it was true, and everyone knew that it was true, that his research and work were focused entirely on one order, the order of the days of creation, which he later saw to be the word order. So he was focused on the pattern, wasn't he? Over all those years, focused on the pattern. And the critics came saying, this can be any order. These terms can be in any order. You can have a random order. You can have a random order, and not only that, but you see, by everything that he had already accomplished, he had already proven, really, that it wasn't a random order. So they said, well, okay, then, yeah, but there's two other orders, huh? There are two other orders in the textbook. Why should the word order be so important? Imagine them asking such a question, huh? Just as they accused John Lawrence Sinton of focusing too much on the definition of God in recapitulation in his class teaching. And that's the whole foundation of the class teaching, huh? Is the answer to the question, what is God, and the whole remainder of recapitulation, it unfolds out from that question, unfolds all of the implications of the answer to that question. And so John Sinton was severely criticized for spending too much time on the definition of God. And here John Dorley was asked, why should the word order be so important? And he knew the answer. He knew that it was because of what that word order answered, because it was the foundation of the teaching of Christian Science, as Mrs. Eddy intended it to be for her primary students, to be that which instructed the student of Christian Science. But as John Dorley was wont to do, he always took in every criticism. A wonderful quality of love, not to exclude the criticism, but to take it in, to feel, yes, there's some measure of truth in this. You see, it was a fluctuation. Imagine the fluctuation after having reached that standpoint of knowledge about the subject of Christian Science, to have done that research of the textbook, and perhaps surely be more intelligently informed, spiritually, scientifically informed about the subject of Christian Science than anyone had ever been since Mrs. Eddy's time. That group was, and to have the so-called authorities come in and critique that and say, you are wrong. You're wrong to do what you're doing. This had to be some kind of a fluctuation, but I suppose that he was so thoroughly drilled in the days of creation, in the sevenfold order of the Word, in the creative order, that he must have lived his whole life on that basis, from that order. And so he naturally took it in, and didn't feel this is something that will destroy me, it's something that will wipe me out, but he took it in and he said, that's right, there are two other orders. And so he began to look at those two other orders.